Okay, welcome to my shop. I probably get 2 or 3 requests per month from people that want to make their own scales for knives. And since most of the knives I work with are Emersons, most of these guys are Emerson aficionados, and they're curious as to what kind of tools they need, what kind of skill level they need. So I'm just going to take you through step by step how I do it. It certainly isn't the only way to do it, but it's what I do, and you feel free to leave comments and let me know how you do it, and we'll learn off each other. It's all a learning process. I've been doing this for a few years. It's the first time I've ever done a video though, so bear with me here. I'm used to doing still photography, not videos, so hopefully this will turn out okay and be watchable for you. Okay, what we have here is an Emerson Commander. It's a nice old 2011 model. It's got the back spacer. A lot of the newer Emersons, of course, have the standoffs. I'll probably do a video showing the standoffs, how to do those in a future date. But for now, since most of the Emersons out there are the standoff models, or I'm sorry, the back spacer models, I'm going to do one of those first. So what I plan on doing here is making a set of orange scales for this knife. Oftentimes I get requests to do orange scales a lot, and so it's a pretty common request, so that's what I'll be doing with this knife. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you have a decent set of tools. Don't use cheap screwdrivers. All you'll do is bugger up the screws. I bought this set of Husky screwdrivers at the local Home Depot or Lowe's. They come with Phillips bit on one end, regular screwdriver on the other, and it comes with about 4 different sizes, 3 in the handle, 1 in the tip. You can also buy a set like this that has the torque drivers, which are also very handy to have. Although the quality of the Husky torque drivers are not as great. You can see here, I don't know if you can see on that, but they do have a tendency to deform a little bit. So I did go out a few years ago and invest in a set of what I think are the best screwdrivers made. They're called Weha. They're made in Germany, and these come in a full set of torque drivers from 1 to size 10. I also bought a set of small magnetic Weha screwdrivers that you can put any type of bit in, and they're really high quality, very, very well made. Okay, with that said, let's start taking this apart. Many of you probably have never seen the inside of an Emerson knife. A lot of you might have seen the inside of an Emerson knife, I don't know, but when I do custom scales for an Emerson, I normally have the person send the knife to me, and I do them just the way Emerson built his custom knives. That is, the existing screws are used inside to hold the back spacer in place, and the new custom scales are held in place with 2 or 3 screws, just like his custom models are. So that's what I'll be doing with this model here. So I like to keep a little plastic tray or something here to throw my parts in as I'm taking the knife apart. That way they don't fall, because if I drop a screw, then I spend the next hour or so looking for the darn thing, and usually I never find it anyway. So I try to keep all my parts right here in a plastic lid like this, so that they can all be found again when needed. Okay, most Emerson backspacer models are held together with 4 or 6 screws that alternate from side to side, and you'll see in a minute when we take a look at the liners how the liners are drilled for that. The holes on one side are drilled pass through, the other side the matching hole is tapped. These are 256 screws. .256 screws are the standard screws, guys. Standard screw size for the small screws that are on Emerson knives. The pivot themselves are a 1/4 inch diameter pivot. And again, it's very important to get a screwdriver that fits your pivot properly. You don't want a screwdriver that's too small or too large that'll end up damaging the screw slot or scarfing up your scales. Okay. So now we've got the scale and this side liner off. You can see here the liner with the secondary detent on this model. Being this knife is from 2011, this side of the liner is a good quality stainless steel, whereas the locking side is titanium. The older models are titanium on both sides, but I do think he switched to the secondary liner being stainless steel sometime around 2007, 2008, I believe. Very important, don't lose your stop pin. Here's your back spacer, it's made out of G10. And of course you've got your pivot, and you've got the two stock Emerson Nylotron washers. These washers are very good quality. They really don't need any kind of lubrication. You can run them dry. If I do lubricate any of my Emerson knives, I use a very, very tiny, very small bit of XF7 gun grease. I find it's a real good quality lube to use. It isn't affected by temperature extremes or moisture. It doesn't attract dirt like just putting a lot of oil on your pivot would do. So this will, I mean, you'll see when I put the knife back together, the amount I use is probably smaller than a pinhead, and that's all you need. Okay, so now we got all our parts disassembled. Now what I do when I make new scales, and one thing I want you to keep in mind is everything I do is indexed off of the pivot. Your position of all your handle screws, your stop pin, everything is indexed from the pivot. And you also want to make sure that everything that you use to build the knife with, whether it be new scales or if you're building a new knife, make sure everything is perfectly flat. And a lot of times through use, you know, putting a knife in your back pocket, sitting on it, you'll find that the scales are not flat. So if you check it with a straight edge, like I'm doing here, if you actually look down through there, you probably can't see it, but this scale is bowed quite a bit. So I'm going to be straightening that out before we go ahead and assemble this knife again. And I'll show you how I do that with a El Cheapo $20 Harbor Freight Arbor press. The Arbor presses that are sold at Harbor Freight are probably the only good thing you can get there, besides things like cable ties and crazy glue. As far as tooling goes, you won't see me buy too many tools at Harbor Freight. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just take one of our two scales, take our piece of G10, and again we want to check and make sure this is flat. You put a straight edge on there, look up to the light, and see if you can see any light, you know, shining through. This piece of G10 from American Knife Maker Supply is quite flat. They have pretty good quality stuff there. And all I'm doing now is going to lay my scales on here and just get a rough idea how big a piece of G10 I need. Nothing critical, okay? Just going to take my marker, mark where my pivot is, and just go around the outside edge. Nothing too fancy. It's going to give me a ballpark of how big a piece of G10 I need. Because you'll see as we progress here, we get into our fine work and measurements once our pivot and everything is cut and drilled. Okay, so there's our two scales laid out. My marks are on the outside right now. Okay, and everything I do is going to be geared towards the outside of the scale, and you'll see why in a minute. So now that I know my pivot hole has to be approximately in that position, what I do now is simply take a center punch and eyeball it and get close. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. because I do have some slop here that I can move these scales around the pivot center without being, you know, precisely aligned. Now the diameter of the Emerson pivot, as I said, is 1/4 inch. .25, okay, 1/4 inch. But you may or may not know this, but when you drill a hole, you're not really drilling a round hole. Due to the nature of a drill bit, when you do drill it, the flutes and the cutting edge on it actually give you a hole that's kind of triangular shaped. So anytime I drill a hole that's going to take something like a pivot that's critical, I always run the drill bit a little bit undersized and then ream the hole out with a reamer to the final diameter. Okay, here's a 1/4 inch reamer that I'll use. It's a .25 reamer. Okay, that's going to give you my exact diameter of 1/4 inch when I'm done, and the pivot will fit perfectly. Another thing that's very important, and you can probably get away with this, you know, once or twice, but you're going to find out soon that if you're going to do a lot of scales, you really have to have a drill press that drills a hole that's perfectly perpendicular to the flat surface of the scale. If your drill press is going to drill a hole that's not perfectly aligned square to the scale, then your pivot's going to sit crooked, it's going to be cockeyed, and it's going to create tension. Okay, now we're going to saw off our scales. And again, just going to get it ballpark, nothing too fancy here. What I've got here is a Milwaukee porta band that's set up into a little stand here, a table, which makes it very handy. And getting a little glare there from this light. Let me turn that off a second. Okay. So yeah, here we go. Okay, now that our scales are roughly cut out, we're going to drill our pivot hole. As I said before, we're going to go a little bit undersized and then ream it. So I've got a 15/64 drill bit here that I'm going to use to drill the first hole, the initial hole. And again, I've taken this drill press and spent quite a bit of time tramming the surface to make sure that this shaft is perpendicular, perfectly square to this table all the way around. That's very key. I can't stress that enough. You must have a drill press that drills perfectly plumb holes. And again, we're just drilling here approximately in the center of that ink mark that I made there, where I laid the pivot out. Nothing too critical. Just kind of eyeballing it there and getting it on my center point. Okay, so we've got them drilled with our 15/64 hole. Now we're going to switch over to the reamer. I'm And it's going to give us a perfectly round 1/4 inch diameter hole. And you'll find the thinner the material you're drilling, the more important it is to ream it with something like this, because thicker material, it may look round, but it really isn't. Okay. And with G10 and a lot of these fibrous materials, you see you're going to have a little bit of a burr on the other side. And what you want to do for the next step is you want to take that burr off of there. Okay, so what I do is usually run a little countersink just to bevel the edge of the hole. Pretty much every hole I drill when I'm working gets chamfered. Just enough to knock that burr off. Okay. Now we've got a counterboard for the 3/8 head of our pivot. Okay, now that our scales are roughed out and our pivot hole is drilled and reamed, we'll come over here to the mini mill and we're going to cut our counterbore. Now you can buy drill bits that are already made up to drill, you know, a 1/4 inch pilot and a 3/8 counterbore, but these bits are pretty expensive. Sometimes they're hard to find, but when you do find them, oftentimes they get dull pretty fast, especially when you're cutting things like G10 or titanium, and they're very difficult to sharpen. So this little rig here was designed by a fellow named Tom Watson. I give kudos to him for this, and all it is basically is an aluminum plate that is in my milling vise. The front top surface has been cut with a fly cutter to be parallel to my work table here, and we've got a 1/4 inch round hole that has been drilled and reamed in the plate. And what I can do now is take a gauge pin, set it in that hole, put it up in my quill first to line up the mill with that hole. So now my 3/8 carbide end mill is perfectly centered over the top of that little hole. So now what I do is I take my scale that's been roughed out, and again you have the ink side up because that's the side that's going to be the outside of the scale. We put it underneath this little clamp, which is just a piece of steel held down by 2 screws here. We line it up over top of that hole. Since the mill turns clockwise, it's going to be pulling the piece in this direction, so I pull it over to this side typically to tighten it up and to hold it in place. And then we just snug up these screws, and that's going to hold our scale right where we want it. So this 3/8 carbide bit is going to cut right around the center of that hole. But I also forgot, before I do that, what we want to do is set our depth. Now typically on an Emerson scale, the depth of the G10 at the base of the counterbore is about a 1/16 of an inch. So I've got a 1/16 of an inch here on my machining square. I just simply lay that down. I bring my bit down till it touches off on that square. I lock it, and then I bring my quill stop up and I set our depth stop to that setting. Okay, now we take our quill back up. We lock our scale in place using the index pin. And again, like any milling operation, your setup and your holding is about 60% of the job. So now we remove the gauge pin and we ream our counterbore. Very quick, very clean, very easy. And now we've got that 3/8 counter bore drilled, and it is perfectly centered around our 1/4 inch pivot hole. Okay, we're done counter boring both scales. And as you can see now, the pivot with the 3/8 head fits right in there beautifully. It's also perfectly square to the surface of the scale, which is very important. Okay, now that our pivots are drilled and counter bored, now comes the part of the build where we get a little bit more precise with what we're doing. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to index our liners to these scales using the pivot, and then we're going to profile the scales, drill the holes to mount the scales, and also tap the liners to take the mounting screws. So to do that, we start out by picking our pivot, putting it in the hole, and again we're going to index everything off of that. We're dealing with the locking side here, so we're going to take our locking side scale, we're going to index it to the pivot. Okay. Now what I do here is I have a little setup I use with just a thick washer that I put over top of that pivot shank that allows me to screw a dummy screw down on top of that to hold the pivot in place. And all I use for that is a little piece of G10, just drill that like a washer. I put our pivot screw on there and I snug up the pivot. Now since the bottom of our counter bore hole is perfectly flat, the sides are perpendicular, everything's going to index nice and straight when I do that. Okay, so now I align the scale to the liner so that I have a good piece of G10 all the way around. Okay, and now I use these very handy clamps that I bought a while ago from a dude over in South Africa. I forget his name, but these clamps are the greatest thing ever invented. Matter of fact, I'm going to make myself a set of these here, so I have another set. But these are absolutely awesome because what they do is they apply pressure from underneath and everything stays square to the underneath face of this clamp. So you can clamp irregular objects in these and still drill perpendicular down through the face of whatever you're clamping. It makes it really nice to align parts and to drill parts and get them perfectly straight. So what I'm going to do here is clamp this down here near the stop pin, and also down here at the base of the scale. So what we're going to do is once we have these clamped up, we're going to drill the holes for our new scale attachment screws, but we're also going to drill the lanyard hole here and also the clip screw holes while we have this clamped up. And we are also going to index and drill the relief for our stop pin. The next step you want to do is figure out how many screws you want to put into the scale to hold the new ones in place. The Commander's a pretty big knife. You could probably go with 3 screws here, but in this case I'm going to go with 2. So I kind of divided this scale up into 3 equal parts, drew some lines across here, and then took those lines and bisected them to get the center of the point there. And what you want to do here, of course, is miss this cutout for the locking liner cut, and every Emerson knife is going to be different in that regard, so you have to do that layout very carefully so that when we drill and tap this hole here, we don't hit this cutout for the leaf spring. Okay, so once we have our 2 points laid out, we then want to center punch them. Okay, then I go back over them again with a little bit of a heavier center punch just to make sure my drill doesn't skip around. Okay, now that our liners and scale is clamped up like this, we can now go ahead and scribe around the outside, because this is going to be the precise alignment of the profiling of our scale when we go to profile it over on the grinder. And again, now everything is being indexed off of our pivot. Okay? Okay, while we have it clamped, we're going to go ahead and drill our lanyard hole too while we have it here. Okay, now we're going to drill and tap our holes to hold our new screws. When you're tapping titanium, you can't go by the standard drill tap sizes. You have to go one size bigger. So for a 256 tap in titanium, I drill a 5/64 hole. Okay, because you want to use a thread forming tap, not a thread cutting tap when you're doing titanium. Titanium scale here, the liner, right through our new scale, so that the two holes will precisely line up later. Also going to drill the relief for our stop pin. I use a 2-flute 3/16 end mill. The Emerson stop pin is 3/16 diameter, so we're going to drill that now. Again, we're just going to drill a blind hole, a little pocket, just for that stop pin to seat into. It's about 1/8 of an inch deep. And when I say approximately 1/8 of an inch deep, we can always come back later and adjust it if we need to when we go to assemble the knife. If we have to make it a little bit deeper, then we can do that at that time. And again, the hole in our liner is what is indexing and guiding our end mill to drill that flat bottom hole for the stop pin. Now we're going to get a drill bit that can drill through and mark our 3 clip screw holes. And again, here you want to pick a drill bit that's going to just clear the inside dimension of those clip screw holes that are already threaded. And since we're clamped up here already, I'm just going to go ahead and drill these all the way through. And again, they will be perfectly indexed now to all the rest of our screws. Okay, off camera I went ahead and clamped up the other liner. I marked the layout holes for the scale screws off the other liner with a fine point red marker. So I got both liners now drilled for the new scale screws. Now what I'm going to do is chamfer those holes. Just a little bit, take the bar off. It was rough drilling. Plus, if you chamfer these holes, it makes it easier to tap. Okay, now they're both ready to go ahead and tap. Okay, now I'm over here at my tapping station. I have a small drill press that's totally dedicated for nothing more than tapping. I've got it installed with a Tapmatic. Let's see. It's a number 7001. I've got a 256 thread forming tap in there. And all we do now is put down our liners, make sure we have a little bit of lubrication on here. You never want to tap stainless or titanium dry. And we go ahead and tap. thing about this Tapmatic is it automatically reverses when you release the quill. And now our holes are tapped. Easy peasy. Okay, next we want to take our scales that have been drilled and we want to drill through these holes now with a drill bit that allows our 256 screws to pass through. And we're not only doing the scale screw holes but also the 3 holes for our clip that we indicated earlier. Okay, now that we have those holes drilled, we now want to drill a clearance hole for the 256 screw heads. And this is about a 3/16 inch drill. But now we don't want to drill these scales all the way through with this drill bit. We only want it to go in far enough that allows the screws to bottom out and hold the scale tightly to the liner. On the Emerson scales, they leave about a 1/16 of an inch of G10 underneath, so I have a set of feeler gauges here. I have these set up for about a 1/16 of an inch deep, and I put that underneath my drill bit now and set my drill stop on my quill. Bring it down, lock the quill in place. Now when you drill these, you cannot just hold them by hand. If you do, sure enough, the G10 is going to be pulled up onto the drill bit. If it drills all the way through, these scales are ruined. So when you drill these, you have to have them clamped down as you drill them. Okay? So I have a little vice grip drill press clamp here that I set for the thickness of the G10. And that'll hold it in place for us. They're lined up. And also be sure now to drill the side of the scale that's got your counter bore. Okay? That's going to be the outside of your scale. Okay, now our scales are drilled and counterbored for the screws. Okay, now we go over to our bench and we screw the scales down to our liners now. Okay, I mentioned earlier about straightening out this liner. It's got a little bit of a bow to it. And what I want to do now is use my arbor press for that. I check the scale to see which way it's bowed. Okay, so we have to push down on this side. So we're going to put it in here and give it a little bit of a push down with the arbor press. And then we hold it up to the light and make sure that that is now nice and straight. And yeah, we're looking good. Time to mount our scales to our liners. And once we do that, we can go ahead and profile them now. And everything will line up perfectly because everything's being indexed again off the pivot. Alright, so we take our locking side scale. We throw our pivot in there. Again, I have to use a scrap pivot. I don't have to use the one off the actual knife. Put her on there. Line up our key mark. And now put our screw in the hole. and screw it on. So my hands don't get tired. I have a little power screwdriver I use for that. These screws are long. I get whatever's on sale. Last time I bought these, I got screws that were 3/4 of an inch. And they're going to be sacrificial screws anyway. I'm going to be cutting them off. So now our scale is tightened down to our liner. And now we can go ahead over to the grinder, the belt grinder, and we can profile right along our liner to get our exact size of our G10. We're going to just bring the grinder right up to barely touching the outside of the liner, and that way they'll fit perfectly. And again, everything is indexed off the pivot. And believe it or not, everything lines up perfectly because we've already done that when we clamped our liners to our scales to drill all of our holes. So everything just lines up beautifully. We've got the proper size hole drilled in here, the clearance for our screw heads, proper size hole for the screws to pass through, and everything lines up real nice. You see our pivot lines up, everything's indexed off of that. There's the stop pin, lines up perfectly, seats in there real nice. So once we get to this point, now it's time to go over to our TW90 grinder, and we're going to profile these scales right up to the edge of the liners. And we're almost home. Okay, we're over here now at the TW90 grinder, and we're going to profile both of our scales right down till they almost touch the liners. Just need to put on the shock back here. I do profiling in the grinder like this. I like to get right up on top so I'm looking right straight down the belt. That way I can tell exactly how close I am to getting close to the liners here when I'm doing the profiling. Okay, so both scales are now profiled right up to the edge of the liner, and I'll probably change my wheel over to a smaller 2-inch or 1-inch diameter wheel to get this finger coil here a little bit closer. But you could do it also with hand files or with a Dremel using a rotary drum tool. Works just as well. Okay, I've switched over now to my 1-inch small wheel on the TW90. And one nice thing about this grinder is you can instantly go from a vertical grinding position right to a horizontal position. Sit down off the table, swing it over, and we're good to go. I'm going to drop in our other tool rest here. And we can go. Gets in that finger choil real nice. Alright, now that our scales have been profiled, you may be wondering, well, these screws that we just used hold these scales to these liners, but what about the original screws that held the knife together? What do we do with those? Well, that's going to be our next step. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually have them underneath of these new scales by countersinking where the screws go through the liners. We're going to countersink some holes here, the pass-through holes. There's 2 on each side. You have the smaller holes here that are threaded, and you have the larger ones here that are what are called the pass-through holes. And we'll mark those with a red marker so I don't get mixed up as far as which holes to countersink and on which side. We're working on the outside of the knife now, looking down. So these pass-through holes, there's 4 of them, are going to be countersunk to take the head of a 256 flathead screw. We're not going to use the original screws that we took out of the knife because we're going to keep them in case the owner ever wants to convert this knife back to original stock configuration. So we're just going to use regular flathead 256 screws. Again, I bought these, they're 1 inch long. I got them on the cheap, so it doesn't matter, we're going to cut them down anyway. But what we're going to do now is go to the drill press. We're going to countersink these holes so the screws fit flush, and then we'll come back and we'll start to see if we can assemble the knife as is before we even contour the scales and make sure everything works. Okay, so we saved you the boring viewing of countersinking these holes, but what you can see now is we've countersunk the holes where these screws pass through, and you have to make it deep enough so that when you put the screw in there, the screw head sits flush or below the surface of the liner. That way the new scale will sit right on top of that. This is the way all Emerson customs were built, and that's the way we do ours too. So what we'll do now is we're going to assemble the knife and just to make sure everything works okay in the configuration we have it here. Even before we contour the scales, we're just going to see if everything fits and everything works. Okay, so we take our bottom scale and our pivot, get that put in there, Drop the liner on. Now before we even do that, and again, this is a common mistake, but you can't put the scales on until you assemble the knife with the backspacer. So we're going to drop in 2 of our screws. Going to throw the backspacer on there. Okay. And then the other side of the liner goes on too. Get the screws started in here. And we're going to run them in. Get my cheater here. And we're just going to do these, just snug them up, not real tight, because we're going to still have to kind of adjust this with the stop pin and everything, make sure everything's squared up properly before we actually tighten everything down. Get them both started in there. And what you want to do now is just set it down on a hard surface. Make sure everything's evened up. Put the stop pin in. Make sure that it's sitting nice and straight, crosswise. Okay. And once everything's plumbed up like that, now we can tighten these screws down. And of course, these are sticking out pretty far here, so what we're going to do now is trim these off with a pair of side cutters. Okay, now we're going to go over to the grinder again, and we're going to grind down these studs sticking out that we cut off nice and flush with the liners, so that nothing will protrude and that the new scales will sit nice and flat on there. And one thing any serious knife pimper or modder needs to have is a drawer full of hardware. And as you can see here, I have quite an assortment of various size screws, nuts, bolts, you name it. Washers, boneyard back here with old clips and backspacers from knives I've worked on. The boneyard in the hardware drawer. Okay, we're back from the disc sander. Disc sander is what I use to file these stubs down or the screws sticking through. It gives you a nice flat surface, and now everything sits nice and smooth, and the new scales will sit right on top of that. So now it's time to go and profile our scales. And I put the knife together before I started this segment, and everything fits probably fine and everything works. But now we have to contour the scales. And what I use for that, I've got one of these 100-pound fishing magnets that I stuck to a little steel plate. And I've got a bunch of holes drilled and tapped all over that, 256 holes, that I can screw my scale right to. Then when I take it over to the belt sander, I got a nice handle to hold on to, and I can go ahead and profile that scale and get it nice and round it off. So that's a pretty handy device to use. Okay, before we're ready to go over to do our contouring, normally on the surface gauge I will scribe a line all the way around the edge of the liner to give me my height of my new liner, my new scales. Okay, I did it here in pencil so it would show up better on the video. But normally I'll put a scribe line there. So now when I go over to the grinder to do my contouring, I know where to stop, how deep to go. Okay, so next I'll be going over on the TW90 and we'll contour these scales. Alright, so once we got our scales contoured, we need to kind of melt the edges a little bit because this edge of the contoured scale is rather sharp. No G10 can take a pretty decent edge, as testified by the G10 knives that are out there. They're good for a one-time cut, but they can also be made into a dagger, and it's very effective. So these edges have to be taken down a little bit. Now I just take some 60 grit emery paper here, and we go around the scale and kind of melt the edges there. You don't want to hit the edge that's going up against the liner though. You want to keep that nice and sharp because that's going to fit right up against our liners the way we want it to. But the scales that come in contact with your hand, you definitely want to round it off a bit. And the amount that you do here is up to you. I mean, I do it just enough to take the sharp edge off. Get inside that finger choil especially. Okay, and one other thing I like to do, especially on the side, the show side of the knife where you're going to be unlocking it, or opening the knife I should say, I like to give a little bit more of a chamfer inside here. So it's easier to open a knife. Now on a Commander it's not such a big deal because it does have a pretty large finger choil here. But on other Emerson knives like the CQC8, the 15 and so forth, the A100, especially the 7, a little choil like that really helps out a lot. So for that, I have a Fordham tool, which is just kind of a glorified Dremel, but it does do a really good job of chamfering these edges in here. want to be careful not to go too deep. Okay, so it has a little bit more of a tapered choil down in there. Okay. So at this point, the only thing left to do really is I like to put a little bit of a chamfer again on the lanyard hole so that it's not so sharp. When you've got paracord or something going through there, you want that hole to be a little bit beveled so it doesn't fray your cord. And if you want, you can actually chamfer the screw holes too. So again, nothing feels sharp in your hand when you're holding the knife. Okay, so now to begin assembling the knife, again, we've already got the guts put together here. Everything's lined up pretty square. Everything else kind of like it should be. Get some of this D10 dust off of me here. And we can now start to assemble our knife. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is take the lock side, insert the pivot, drop the liner on there. Now what I like to do is just use a small screwdriver to push the pivot down enough just so I can get the washer on there. And for that I like to use a pair of tweezers. I drop the washer on. Take a look to make sure it's on there. You can simply push the pivot right up through both liners, and that will drop the washer down where it's supposed to be. Next we want to insert the blade. And right now I'm assembling the knife dry. Like I said, I don't use a lot of lubricant on an Emerson. It really isn't needed. But if the owner wants an exceptionally smooth knife, I might put a little bit of that excess 7 grease on, like I said before, but I normally don't even use it. Okay, then we drop that washer in, and I push up on the pivot to kind of hold it in place. Take my small screwdriver and just kind of work it right around that opening, and the washer will settle right in there, and the pivot will drop right in place. Okay. Now we drop in our stop pin. It's sitting in there real nice, just enough of it raised that this relief that's cut in the scale will drop right on there. Okay. And I like to put a little bit of white Teflon tape on my Emerson pivot screws. It's better to use, I think, than Loctite. It's not as messy. It doesn't gum up the works. And we can now just very lightly turn in our pivot screw, just to kind of snug things up a little bit. Okay, the blade's fairly tight right there. And now we can close her up. Make sure the detent works. And then put in our scale screws. Now before, our scale screws that were in there were long. Okay, so we've got to cut them down so they just protrude through the scales. Now I've got a little tool here that I use. You can also put these through the scales and the liners together and simply go to the grinder and grind them off. But another way of doing it, I have a nifty little screw cutter here that Alan Lishowitz has made and patented. It's the best screw cutter I've ever found, and it really works great for knife hardware. He has common size screws here, and simply a matter of putting these screws in there and cutting them off at the proper length. I know from experience that if I take this screw, bottom it out right here, cut it off, that should be just right for a scale that has a 1/16 of an inch at the base of the counter bore. It'll go right in there and it just sits flush inside the liner. It's a perfect length. Of course, there are other screw cutters out there you could use. You can make your own too by simply doing like I did on that contouring plate that I use with the magnet. Just take yourself a plate, drill a bunch of holes and tap them, and use a piece of steel plate that's the proper thickness for what you want. Put the screws in there and simply grind them all flush, and you could do, you know, a dozen screws at once if you wanted to. Okay, that's pretty cool with the black hardware and the orange, kind of like a Halloween knife. Now you may be wondering why this G10 looks kind of dull. It doesn't look like typical G10. That's because after you grind G10, you have to oil it to get it back to looking the way it's supposed to for a knife handle. And we're going to do that in a second. As soon as we get her. And again, when you're putting these final screws in for the scales, you want to feel all around the knife. Make sure none of the scales are protruding on one side or the other. You want to make sure everything's kind of evened up. And if we did everything right before on the grinder, it will be that way. The nice thing about this Elishawitz screw cutter, when you cut the screws, you don't have to do anything else to them. They come out perfect. There's never an issue with getting them started. Really works nice. Okay. So let's pivot up just a bit. See if the knife will walk and talk okay. Got good lock up there. May want to go back with a little bit of sandpaper and hit it a few places, but you'll see now if I take a little bit of oil, put it on the scale, doesn't need a lot. Rub that in. It's going to make that G10 pop right back up the way it's supposed to. Looking like a factory scale. Okay, once both scales are oiled and fit up properly, you take a look at it and see everything works. The last thing to do would be to screw your clip on. You may have to adjust the length of these clip screws if your scales are thicker than stock, because you just want them to barely go through the liner, so you don't want the blade hitting them. But your blade should be perfectly centered anyway, so that shouldn't be an issue. And the only thing left to do is, if the customer wants it, you know, Emerson already supplies some pretty aggressive jimping here on the knife handle, the liners. You may want to take, if the customer wants that jimping to extend over onto the scales, just like the stock Emerson scales are, then you'd want to take a small needle file and file those jimping marks into the G10 as the last finishing step. And at that point, the knife is pretty much complete, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. I appreciate it.